only 3 years ago. We forget what the situation was. We're about to shut down these plants. And then the IRA came and we got these production tax credits for the existing fleet. And that changed everything. There's huge stakes here for the industry as the Trump administration comes in, particularly given Trump has railed against the IRA.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by two-time guest. I'm sure it will be many more times after this, but Phil Chaffee, back by popular demand. We had a great episode, very witty title. Thank you to one of our Decouple listeners for suggesting that in advance. A Westinghouse of Pain, looking at some of the legal entanglements of Westinghouse and the Koreans and KEPCO. But today, Phil, you're back. For those who don't know you, editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly and bureau chief, I love that title, of Energy Intelligence's New York offices. We are here to talk about implications of Trump 2.0 for U.S. nuclear, for the nuclear industry in general. I'm really excited and grateful to have you back, Phil. Thanks for making the time.
Great to be here. I always love this show.
All right. So, the election, big news. We have a Secretary of Energy announced, Chris Wright. There's obviously been a lot of wind in the sails of the nuclear industry throughout the Biden administration. I'm not sure if it started quite that way, but I think a lot of people are arguing that the production tax credits, the investment tax credits, the various subsidy schemes have created a playing field for nuclear, which is, I shouldn't say necessarily the playing field is unprecedented, but the policy environment. People are saying that, certainly within living memory, this was, one of the most pro-nuclear administrations. And there's a lot of big questions in the air. Will the Inflation Reduction Act survive in whole or in part? Will those ITCs and PTCs that are really, creating an investment environment which looks attractive to nuclear, will those remain? And finally, there's been a lot of hype about hyperscalers, coming to fund it all. But, a big rationale there was this idea of, carbon constraint of, fossil fuel infrastructure maybe being penalized. And so those eye-watering PPAs, will they be durable? Does that truly come from the pure-hearted motives of the hyperscalers, or was it a pragmatic response to what they were seeing as a energy policy environment, which was starting to, be less enthusiastic about fossil fuels and more climate-oriented? Obviously, huge change, huge delta in the incoming administration's approach, I think, and philosophical take on the climate issue in particular. So that's my, little introduction diatribe. Phil, you live in America, you're American. What are some of your thoughts? What was, I guess, maybe just, your response to election night? Was that a surprise to you?
Election night was, I don't know if a surprise to me like 2016 was. I think we've all learned that polls don't necessarily tell you what's going to happen. I agree entirely with all of your stage setting. I would say two things. I think policy is everything here. And I think it is absolutely behind a lot of the big tech interests we've seen. All of that really is built on this foundation of policy. A lot of, as we're getting into big tech, going into actual projects with Amazon and Energy Northwest in Washington, with Google and Kairos. Those are built on the idea that these ITCs are going to be there, that the LPO is there with money to throw at these projects. And, policy could shift and these projects could survive, but there is going to be this uncertain period of time where we wait to see what way the policy winds shift in the coming administration. And just in terms of the Biden administration, I think it's, I was at this Texas nuclear summit, the first of a kind thing in Austin this week. And they had what's her name? Kathleen Barron, the Constellation's chief strategy officer. Constellation is the largest nuclear utility in the U.S. And she was talking about just 3 years ago, September 2021, they were about to, on September 15th of that year, they were contemplating, do we or do we not turn off Byron permanently? This is the 2 reactors at Byron in Illinois. And they were waiting at that point for state subsidies. And the state legislature went and voted that day. And they woke up in the morning not knowing. In the evening, they decided to keep it going. But it was really that only 3 years ago. We forget what the situation was. And and then at Illinois, I mean, there was this patchwork of zero energy credits from various states that were keeping some reactors open, but it was very much a patchwork, and it was very much fly by night. It was, can we get these things because we're about to shut down these plants? And then the IRA came, and we got these production tax credits for the existing fleet. And that changed everything. And now basically every new nuclear operator out there is is extending life of their plants, thinking about uprates, and obviously in some very high profile places, turning reactors back on. And all of that goes back to the IRA. So there's huge stakes here for the industry as the Trump administration comes in, particularly given Trump has railed against the IRA, calling it the Green New Scam. And we'll see what happens. I don't think a Republican Senate has the 60 votes needed to fully repeal the IRA, but you can do a lot to dismantle it, both administratively, just basically not, if you're at the LPO, not giving out money or just slow walking everything. And you can just pull away a lot of the funding via budget bills that can just be passed by reconciliation, meaning only 50%. 50 senators need to, or 51, 50 plus the vice president, I guess, need to be there to get that over the line.
What you provided us is a glance sort of into this unknown future. But we do have Trump 1.0. We have a past record to look at. And it's interesting you mentioning how close Byron and Bess were to closure. I think in the Illinois legislature, it was one vote, came down to one vote, keeping those plants on, which, a month or two ago seemed totally insane with, again, this Microsoft deal to restart Unit 1 at 3 Mile Island. It's just such a policy whiplash. But as you say, that's predicated on a bunch of policy decisions. Going back and just trying to pull together a little bit of Trump 1.0 and the record of that first presidency and the work of Secretary of Energy Rick Perry at the time. I was just looking at the number of reactors that were shut down during the Trump administration. So Fort Calhoun, Oyster Creek, Pilgrim, 3 Mile Island Unit 1, Indian Point Energy Center Unit 2. Not really fair to just kind of tally up, the nuclear plants closed under Trump versus Biden. Under Biden, it was Indian Point Unit 3 and Palisades. Being brought back, hopefully. I'm not sure if that will change if these IRA provisions are gone. Invasion of Russia happened in the invasion of Ukraine happened in the meantime. There was some spike in natural gas prices. There was a bit of a level set on nuclear energy that occurred. So again, not totally fair to make those comparisons, but I think a lot of those closures, other than Indian Point that happened under Trump, were due to economic distress, due to deregulated markets and the need for some sort of subsidy for nuclear in those markets in particular. But certainly a lot of plants did close under Trump. The main subsidy that I came across was, I think it was under Rick Perry, and it was a subsidy to try and keep power plants that could hold 90 days of fuel. So that was essentially coal and nuclear online. I'm blanking on the exact name of that subsidy. But those are the sort of two things I cooked up from the Trump administration 1.0. What's your take in terms of what the past can teach us about this uncertain future?
Yeah, so from Trump 1.0, a couple of things. Certainly the rhetoric was always pro-nuclear. Obviously, the shift is not talking about nuclear for its climate change benefits or anti-climate change benefits, but talking about nuclear in terms of energy security and energy nationalism. I think that the two big things I would highlight that you did not mention was ARDP started. So that's the Advanced Reactor Deployment Program, which is a federal cost share with specific advanced reactor developers. The big one there is, and I think these awards happened under Trump. I'd have to go back and check when certainly the legislation for it happened under Trump. But that's where they have a cost share program with X Energy and a separate one with TerraPower, the Bill Gates company. And so that the genesis there was under Trump. And then there was some movement, I think, towards a uranium fuel bank on the nuclear fuel side. The other big thing, I don't know if we'll get to it, was in terms of foreign policy, this push to knock out Russia and China in Central and Eastern Europe as nuclear exports and to really copy their model almost with bilateral MOUs, nuclear MOUs. I forget the full name they called it under Chris Ford at State, but they came up with this whole system to try to knock out the Chinese and Russian competition, and bilaterally through government-to-government agreements, elbow in and bring in U.S. vendors. And that is something the Biden administration has continued. And I think there's every expectation that whatever happens under Trump, that effort will continue. Trump's big thing right now is talking about American energy dominance. And certainly the nuclear industry would get behind that. But I think all of that, if Trump 1.0 is a model, I think probably the industry expects that what happens in Trump 2.0 will somehow, if they dismantle a lot of the IRA and a lot of these, I mean, the IRA is huge, so there's lots of subsidies, so lots of other things, and certainly things incentivizing EVs probably will go away, but the industry is expecting that the nuclear specific things, and we can go through them, will somehow stay.
Maybe before we do that, it might be useful just to talk, particularly for our international audience, about some of the kind of ideological drivers of at least what we can feel about Trump and some of the people that he's named so far, namely Chris Wright, the new secretary. Well, if he's confirmed by Senate, but every expectation he will be the new Secretary of Energy. And I guess how this is going to impact nuclear deployment. What stands out at me is, I think, a strong commitment to free markets. There's that famous saying that nuclear's in this quagmire because the political right loves nuclear but hates government, and the political left hates nuclear but loves government. Under Biden, we had a a political left, if we want to call it that loved nuclear and loved government. But in terms of deployment, certainly with the Vogtle AP1000s, the LPO kicked in, I believe, $12 billion over that time. The cost of capital is such a huge driver, not just for nuclear power plants, but for any other sort of grid updates that we're going to be getting, transmission lines or other infrastructure that's quite costly. My understanding is that, the LPO financing could reduce those capital costs by something like 50%. So if we're talking about actual deployment of nuclear power within the USA, that seems like a potential major issue. I'm sure there's some other ideological drivers. You mentioned, energy dominance as a paradigm, just cheap energy. That seems to be a real hope that can knock down inflation and potentially maybe limit how much tariffing is necessary in order to reshore manufacturing and compete with China. So let's talk a little bit about those ideologic drivers, and maybe we'll get into the policies and politics of the LPO afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the ideological drivers, I mean, as we've said, it's energy security, energy dominance, energy nationalism, and then it's also whatever. I mean, Republicans have always loved nuclear, right? Like, I can't quite account for why there's always been this sort of conservative coded appeal for nuclear, but it has always been there and probably will continue. I would note about Chris Wright, who, just in terms of his nuclear bona fides, so he's the CEO of Liberty Energy, which is a big oil services firm, fracking. But he also, I don't know if you remember this, in March 2023, there was this letter put together, the Declaration of Oil and Gas Executives in Support of Nuclear Energy. And Chris Wright was the first guy to sign this thing. He is super enthusiastic about nuclear. Also, he's invested in Oklo, the microreactor company, and I think is a director there. But that March 2023 letter talks about the undersigned executives recommend the following policy actions, including doing everything reasonably possible to extend the life of existing nuclear power plants and ensure that existing nuclear power plants are not shut down prematurely. And federal and state government should actively facilitate and nurture a nuclear industry capable of enabling the construction and fueling of operational nuclear power plants. It goes on. There's a whole list of policy recommendations there, but it is safe to say he is very enthusiastic. He's also, I mean, despite the name Secretary of Energy, that's not really where a lot of energy policy is. I mean, the U.S. DOE is it comes from the Atomic Energy Commission. Its main job is the nuclear weapons arsenal, and overseeing that. That's almost half of its budget is spent on that. We're obviously, or to those who don't know, we're in the middle of this $2.7 trillion nuclear modernization effort in the U.S. That's including a lot of the weapon systems and blah, blah, blah. But the DOE component of that is huge in terms of keeping the nuclear capability. Then there's a huge part of environmental management, and there's a lot of the nuclear laboratories. And there's the actual energy policy part of it is small. And in terms of what will actually happen to policy under the Trump administration, it's probably not going to be Chris Wright who's making the ultimate decisions there. You didn't mention, but there's also Doug Burgum, who's the North Dakota governor, the Republican North Dakota governor, who Trump has designated as will be the future appointee to the Interior Department to head it. But he will also be Trump's energy czar, heading the National Energy Council. I haven't really found much on what Burgum has said, if anything, about nuclear. It's not really a big issue in North Dakota. But he's a former tech guy. I imagine he's going to be on board with a fairly pro-nuclear agenda. We'll see.
So there's a number of different individuals and roles and departments. Of interest was, again, I was referencing before, Rick Perry's proposed grid resiliency pricing rule, which was a subsidy, again, which would apply to coal and nuclear because of the reliability role they have and being able to store lots of fuel on site. That was rejected by FERC. Now, I mean, my sense as a, Canuckistani up here in Canada looking downwards is that, the Trump style of politics seems kind of by diktat a lot of the time. I'm not sure, again, the ways to which, the beautiful American system with lots of checks on power will limit some of that. But it was interesting that FERC was able to say, yeah, no thanks, Rick Perry. Do you think there's going to be a change administratively in terms of the power of some of the individuals we talked about to direct policy? Once DOGE gets in there, the Department of Government Efficiency, fires off the deep state and gets rid of all the middlemen.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it comes very hard. And obviously, what we learned in Trump 1.0 is they didn't really have a great job dealing with courts. There was a whole lot of pushback anytime they tried to do anything, even before the courts, just going through the procedures and public consultations you need to really lock in a policy change was not something Trump 1.0 was great at. Presumably, there's a bit of learning there, although a lot of these appointees are not coming from places of that learning. So it's hard to know, and there's obviously going to be a lot of capricious uncertainties there.
The way things are being described, I think, in the buildup to January 20th is like on day one, all this stuff's going to happen. And I think, as you were saying, while there are executive orders, there's maybe limits to how those policies will unfold on the ground.
There is also still lots of regulatory uncertainty. I mean, you mentioned FERC. This is a whole other monster here, but there's a huge debate now at FERC on how to think about things like behind the meter PPAs. Where we saw this with Talon and Amazon. That's a different story. But there is a whole lot of regulatory uncertainty around a lot of how the new business model of nuclear and other things might work. I'd also, just in terms of the uncertainties, I think another big component of the Trump energy policy is not going to be nuclear specific, but what happens with other energy. I mean, we've talked about this sort of tax incentives and policy drivers, a lot of them behind this current nuclear boom hike. But another part are the other side of the equation, where there are ESG goals or state renewables mandates or state clean energy mandates that are preventing utilities from putting out from IRP plans that basically just go all gas. And that is what happened 15 years ago to basically kill nuclear renaissance at 1.0. There was tons of excitement about basically every regulated utility out there was putting out COL applications. And then almost overnight, as gas prices plunged and power prices plunged on the back of the fracking revolution, those plans were all canceled. So what happens under Trump 2.0 with gas and oil is another thing. And I mean, everyone is expecting him to end Biden's restriction or temporarily pause on LNG exports, which he will certainly try to do, but then that will probably face legal challenges. And nothing is very certain. And there is going to be, I think, no matter what policies are ultimately implemented, there's going to be a lag, A, getting them out the door, and then B, getting them past legal challenges. So it's going to be a while before any dramatic shifts in the entire energy landscape happen.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like without a carbon policy, and with ultra cheap natural gas, and with a sort of free market leads the way mentality, that what's likely to get built is a lot more gas and probably a lot more solar as well. To be frank, depending on how that's tariffed and the production capability within the U.S. and I guess whether that would survive the IRA. There's so many questions up in the air. Um, a big one though really is, I think, on the LPO. In Trump 1.0, there was not a Senate confirmed director of the LPO. They continued to fund Plant Vogtle, but there wasn't a lot of new loans being made. My understanding is under the Biden administration, the LPO office has been quite busy and quite central. Do you have any hot takes on this or any predictions? Or
Yeah, I mean, so I think an easy prediction is that the nuclear specific LPO loans that have been basically agreed and finalized for the restart of Palisades and to keep Diablo Canyon going in California, it's hard to imagine a Trump LPO pulling those away, right? Um, there is
and is that because of just bad headlines? Like it would look bad to be shutting nuclear power plants. I mean, if we got to that place of social license and culture wars, where I mean, because you can find an argument, maybe not with Diablo Canyon, where it's so hard to build gas and everything else, but there's other places where if the hyperscalers really want a lot of capacity. I don't know if you can build natural gas easily in Michigan. I'm out of my waters here, but like there's probably a cheaper way just to put capacity on the grid if you just want to run data centers, and that's natural gas, I imagine. So I'm just curious. Like I thought I'd sort of been moving through this progressive sort of stages history where we were fighting to prevent nuclear plants being shut down, and now to restart, and now new build, and it really seemed like that we would never see these premature closures of nuclear power plants. Just wondering again, sorry, long question, but is this just going to be sort of culturally motivated by the political right not being able to tolerate that, or is there a more pragmatic driver?
probably culturally, not just culturally, but also just politically. I think the nuclear industry has very close ties with I think a lot of this incoming administration, and knows how to get in the room with Trump, I think. And it's and as you said in your introduction about Three Mile Island, it's almost universally praised, this restart. Like there's very little pushback there. There is obviously some local legal challenge, but yeah, it's hard for me to at almost universally praise, and I think universally praise on the right. So it's just hard to see how they pull the rug out from under those projects.
I guess all I'm saying here is that Vogtle and the initial sort of nuclear renaissance and the LPO itself was founded under George W. Bush's administration, adamantly pro-nuclear administration, but the fracking boom snuffed the nuclear renaissance. So even sort of with all the right rhetoric and right intentions, the follow through costs money. And if there's a cheaper option, maybe those could fall apart. I'm just playing devil's advocate, but
No, yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And the big counterbalancing factor, in particularly once we're talking about real money and real billions, is the other policy objectives, and in particular tax cuts. And I think if, as is expected, whatever happens to LPO happens via some big budget bill, um, it'll probably be directly competing with tax policy, other tax policy, and tax cuts, and that's where I mean billions, hundreds of billions, I think, of unspent money that the LPO has, and hundreds of billions, of uncommitted money. I think there's even more than that that's unspent, but sort of committed via an agreement. And that's going to be the big question, whether a Republican Congress somehow defends. I think the latest LPO update was that there's $67.2 billion in remaining loan authority for clean energy. There's a whole lot more for other things, and if they pull out from EVs and various other things, potentially even more could go to nuclear, or none could go to nuclear. So that is where, but that's all going to be cleared out in Congress, much more so than the administration. Obviously, the administration Trump has to ultimately sign whatever Congress does there, but it's ultimately going to be this Republican-controlled Congress and what their priorities are. And I don't know. A lot of very pro-nuclear people on the Republican side voted against the IRA, but then said, well, we like parts of it, but not the whole thing. So it's ultimately, what does Congress do there? And if Congress does nothing, then it comes back to that issue of a Trump LPO. If somehow Congress doesn't go after this money that has not been spent by the LPO, would the Trump administration just do nothing with the LPO outside of dispersed funds that have already been agreed? Possibly, but again, it's not the industry's expectation that they're going to lose all the LPO money. I would also say, I already talked about sort of the LPO is that it's out there is an assumption backstopping a lot of these big tech new nuclear deals. I think the other big policy thing the industry has been gearing up for, and we've seen this slow build of this, is energy behind some sort of fleet deployment of AP1000s. And that would require a huge amount of money, obviously. If you're talking some sort of big utility consortium, fleet deployment type scenario, and that's what my guess is the industry might be trying to push for. Okay, well, let's stop talking about LPO for particular nuclear projects and talk about LPO finance or some sort of reallocation of this money for a fleet. But that's all very hypothetical. I don't know.
That'd be a muscular piece of government intervention in the markets. Very muscular. And I think the only way they could be sold on that is, listen, we're falling behind the Russians and the Chinese are about to overtake us all in terms of the reactor export market, and the geostrategic implications of that, of these century-long relationships and dependencies that are created by nuclear exports. There's an argument that says if you want to be credible about deploying reactors abroad, you should be able to construct them at home. Notably, the Chinese just turned on a CAP, which is basically just an enlarged AP1000, a CAP 1400. They got it done in 5 years. So, we know that AP1000s can get built fast if you have the right supporting architecture, but that's quite a kickstart that needs to happen to get all the ducks in a row in the U.S. for that. Do you think the geostrategic call will be strong enough to motivate that kind of investment? And to be clear, I think we'd be talking about if LPO put up $12 billion for Vogtle 3 and 4, we'd be talking multiple tens of billions of loan authority.
And to be clear, I am not saying that this is going to happen. I'm saying it is there is
We're
a
speculating.
push. The speculative, and there's a push in the industry for something like that. Were you to make the argument for that push, I think you could very easily say, if we actually get up some sort of fleet scale deployment of AP1000s, that would make things much easier to deploy in this geostrategic region in Central and Eastern Europe. Suddenly, if we're really building 8, 9, 10 more of these reactors in the US, then building the same things in Poland and Bulgaria, in Sweden, or in Ontario, for instance, would become easier and potentially become cheaper. And yeah, so I think you could make that argument. Again, as you said, it is massive, muscular government intervention. And is that really going to come from this Republican Congress and from the Trump administration? I don't know, but they'll probably be getting the pitch.
on that front, in terms of the financing side, it seems like there's a lot of assumptions nowadays that, hey, the hyperscalers have really deep pockets and they're going to be the source of finance for the American nuclear renaissance. We've seen a willingness to pay very, very high PPAs. I guess they haven't all been disclosed, but presumably, pretty eye-watering. And those that we have heard about are quite high. If you have the specific numbers, I'd love to hear it. They're not going to slip my mind for now. But in terms of what motivates those high PPAs, again, it's either just the incredible climate concern of like the tech elites, or it's a read of the markets and a read of the kind of energy futures and constraints that might be imposed on them. Like, to what degree do you think it is? Because there's certainly a lot of firms, Apple and Google, I believe, who have talked about buying enough renewable energy credits to say that they're 100% renewable powered. I mean, it is. There's just because Trump won the election doesn't mean there's not a significant group of the population that cares about climate. But again, in terms of motivating these companies' willingness to pay really, really eye-watering PPA numbers, do you think that's under threat in a more sort of pro-fossil fuel administration in an inflationary environment where people are caring about cost of living and appreciate the price of energy coming down?
No, I don't. I don't see a huge shift in the sort of whatever the ESG drivers are for big tech. Um, and I think we're also going to see a lot of big tech investment in more gas plants to power data centers. It's not just going to be nuclear. But they do have those ESG drivers, which are longer than any particular administration, and which are still very relevant in lots of foreign markets and lots of states. So I think those remain, but even a very high 100 plus BPA does not a reactor build. Like, you still need the upfront capital, and you still need someone to take on that construction risk. And we have not seen that yet. We've seen some upfront capital now from Amazon with Energy Northwest, and X Energy, and also the investment in X Energy, I should say. Um, but again, that is basically upfront capital to fund some of the pre-final investment decision stuff, some of the sort of pre-application stuff. It's development work stuff. And I think it's all then hinged on, there will probably be a PPA for that specific Energy Northwest Amazon deal, but that's PPA is then meant to be used to backstop an application to the LPO. So ultimately, they're still talking about, and I think we're depending on LPO and big chunks of cash coming from the government.
It seems like there's two competing visions for the future of nuclear energy in America. One we've sort of elucidated, which is this idea of a significant degree of state-backed funding to create low-cost capital for a fleet deployment of a large, advanced but conventional reactor like the AP1000. Which again, that's sort of, I think, one compelling vision, which I think the DOE started to really drift towards, particularly in the most recent pathways to commercialization for advanced nuclear liftoff, as they put it. And then the other vision is, I think, something that's a little more appealing to that sort of free market psychology, which is, hey, we don't need the subsidies. We've got fancy new technology that's coming down the line that will be maybe even cheaper than gas. We just need you to take the regulatory brakes off. And to me, that gets all the dopamine receptors firing on maybe this sort of side of the political aisle, where it's like, yeah, we don't like the idea of the states intervening in markets and distorting markets with subsidies or strategic finance like this. Let's just deregulate. And America's a nation of innovators, and let this nuclear innovation take off and develop advanced reactors, which will outperform existing technologies and be financeable because they're small, and everything else we've been hearing sort of for the last 10 or 15 years out of the advanced nuclear space.
I'm sorry, Chris, are you saying that there's advanced reactor developers who are saying we don't like the subsidies?
I wouldn't quite go that far. I think there's some that would say we don't need them. But yeah, I mean, pounce.
Color me skeptical.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe you could go find some quotes out there from someone saying we don't need them. But those same folks are also salivating at the investment tax credits and the ARDP and any bits of cash they can pull from the government. Even Bill Gates, who famously looks like he's set to take a fair amount of construction risk on by building a first of a kind Natrium reactor for TerraPower. But even that is premised on a lot of ARDP funding. It's premised on, I think, any sort of all of these subsidies will go into that, right? Like, I would be shocked if any developer out there says, we don't need this, or sorry, we don't want this stuff. Um, Maybe they'll make the case that nth of a kind will be able to compete with solar and onshore wind, and we won't need anything. Probably a bunch of people would say that, um, but they'll all take the government money they can get until then.
I mean, yeah, it seems, again, we've talked about these two competing visions. Thank you for your clarification there. No one's going to turn down a subsidy, I don't think. I mean, if anyone wants to subsidize decouple, I'll take all comers basically at this point. Okay, okay. Okay, so we've talked LPO, we've talked I guess these sort of like competing visions going forward. Um, why don't we talk about, I guess, some of the other forms of energy and how you sort of foresee them being impacted? I know that we're mostly focused on nuclear here, but with Chris Wright as the appointee, we're likely to see significant support. I mean, how much cheaper can gas get in the U.S.? And I think there's a big narrative here again around like if we just get energy cheaper, it's going to be sort of this ultimate economic stimulus. I think where we've seen a lot of industrial growth has been in the American South and the heartland there, and it's not necessarily been in the Permian Basin or in Pennsylvania on top of the Marcellus fields. It's been, I think, as a result of industrial policy, some of it coming from the IRA, but booming manufacturing sectors in Georgia and South Carolina. And I think some Republican representation there pushing back on the eagerness to do away with the IRA. Maybe let's meander over into that territory a little bit, if you don't mind.
I mean, U.S. domestic production of both oil and gas has climbed up from under the Obama administration, under the Trump 1.0, under the Biden administration, and it'll probably keep going up. I don't think anyone is anticipating, I mean, Trump might be. I don't think anyone in the industry is anticipating that production to super take off. I mean, the levers Trump has to encourage that, there's a lot of permitting reform and things that should make things a bit smoother. And I think Bergen will certainly try to push that stuff through. In terms of pulling prices down for domestically, again, I think it's my colleagues who know a lot more about this stuff might push back on me, but if they really are able to export a lot more, then I'm not sure that helps U.S. domestic prices so much. It's good for the oil and gas folks, but ultimately that means they're not forced to that supply can go to much pricier demand elsewhere. So I don't know. I don't think it's a sure thing that oil and gas prices are going to come way down in the U.S. I think probably on the renewables side, we're probably not going to see much more offshore wind for a while. Um, but solar and onshore wind can survive a lot without federal subsidies, particularly because there's a lot of state subsidies in a lot of places. Even without EV mandates from the IRA, there's California and maybe I think 12 other states that have various EV mandates. And that's a huge enough market that all the car manufacturers are going to be still building for that. So I'm not sure if we're going to see huge seismic shifts in really any of the other energy things. One big question mark is hydrogen. There's the 45V credits for hydrogen production in the IRA. It's unclear what will happen there. And there is one of the hydrogen hub projects. Actually, just today, the DOE awarded $1 billion to the Midwest hub, which theoretically might include some nuclear-produced hydrogen off the back of what Constellation's been doing at 9 Mile Point with a very pilot thing. But hydrogen also has a lot of buy-in from the oil and gas industry. On the other hand, is that something Trump cares about at all? I don't know. So that's a question mark. But yeah, basically, I don't foresee huge seismic shifts there, but
No, I mean it is fascinating the way that the LNG export capacity couples U.S. gas prices to Europe by again connect. It's not a stranded resource anymore, so that is interesting. Assumptions around what the price dynamics will be. Um, all right, Phil. I mean, do you have anything else major to add? This is obviously a very sort of speculative episode. A lot of vibes and feels here, but I think we're laying out like a pretty good structure of what the possibilities are.
yeah, I mean, it's the other big thing I'll be watching. We talked a little bit about the foreign stuff. Is a lot of these the Biden administration has pushed along a lot of these projects, particularly these AP1000 projects in Poland, in Bulgaria, and also the U.S. scope of the completion of Chernobyl, the two Romanian reactors, which obviously are Canadian, and um, but I guess whether there's going to be real follow through in federal funding via U.S. Exim, the Export Import Bank, um, and the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. Um, there's been a lot of MOUs and stuff on that front, but it will probably be up to the Trump administration to really lock in those doors and lock in those deals and bring them to final investment decisions and even to construction. And that is the other big thing we'll be watching. And I guess then to what extent they are successful in trying to, I mean, the Biden administration has a million MOUs and 1, 2, 3 negotiations and very small bits of funding for FEED studies and SMR feasibility studies and things like that, and all over the world. And how successful the Trump administration might be in picking that stuff up and actually making projects happen will be interesting to watch.
I mean, it does seem like there is this. I'm not sure the exact commitment of tax cuts that the Trump administration is committing itself to, but multiple trillions it sounds like. And within the IRA, I've heard sort of $1 trillion of spending into the 2030s. So that's an attractive sort of piggy bank to rate if you want to think about it that way. I'm not sure how important or how sizable these XM Export-Import Bank, funding requirements would be for some of those Eastern European allies. I think a lot of that is occurring in the context as well of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and trying to sort of support those Eastern European NATO allies. I'm not sure how that shifts in terms of a pivot in relations with Russia. I'm not sure if you have any insights there.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about that wild card, but obviously Trump said he's going to be negotiating some deal to end the war in Ukraine on day one. Was it day one after he's elected? Or
I think it was before.
On the off chance he somehow has this amazing plan that works, that could change a lot. And that would, if they really came to a deal there and we reversed the sort of the seismic geopolitical shifts that we've seen over the past, certainly over the Biden administration, who knows what could happen? I mean, suddenly would Russian nuclear fuel start coming back into the U.S. market? Would HALEU start coming? It could change everything. And, I don't think the chances of that are high at all, but were it to happen, it could have huge implications. Would Russia suddenly be more, and probably not be more competitive in Europe? But who knows? If the war really ended, maybe Europe would want all that natural gas again, flowing from Russia. So again, this is very, very silly hypotheticals, but yeah, I mean, the other wild card is what happens with China. There's not, I think basically the civil nuclear links to China are almost completely done outside of some enriched uranium coming in from China. But that is not market moving stuff.
And this is a little, well, it's almost completely off topic, but I'm just that delta between where things were at. I'm not sure if it would have been under Bush, but when those bilateral agreements were being signed with China, when Westinghouse was giving its IP to the Chinese, in this heyday of globalization, it really did seem like this would be a cooperative relationship that would really ignite the capabilities of the nuclear industry, leveraging China going first on the AP1000s. I mean, what a remarkably different world we live in now.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a long period of time when it looked like Westinghouse's whole strategy was we are going to work with the Chinese, or we're going to build all those AP1000s in China, but we're going to work together with SMPTC, now SPIC, on exporting that technology to third countries. And that's all gone, obviously. I mean, Westinghouse still gets tiny bits of scope in the Chinese CAP1000s now, but it's not hugely significant. Um, yeah.
And just lastly, I guess probably close on this one. And again, just trying to tack on some extra tidbits here. But in terms of the recent announcements by Russia on sanctioning export of enriched uranium, I know there's been a number of efforts. They seem to be largely symbolic so far on the U.S. side to limit uranium imports. It seems a bit like slapping the hand that feeds you when we're talking about such a constraint on American SWU and its dependence on Europe and Russia to get those enrichment services. But maybe just in your role as nuclear intelligence guy, catch us up a little bit on that. You mentioned the potential repercussions if relations were dramatically improved with Russia, but where are we at right now in terms of enriched fuel? Sorry, not fuel, as I've been corrected, but Russian enrichment services and U.S. Dependence and relations on that front.
To go back to this summer, the Congress passed and then Biden signed this ban on the import of enriched uranium from Russia, with waivers available through the end of 2027. So we've seen a couple waivers granted, and there's two big categories of imports that have been coming into the U.S. of Russian low enriched uranium, LEU. There's been uranium coming in that 10X, the Rosatom subsidiary, has direct contracts with some U.S. utilities. And there's been uranium coming in to go to Constellation or Vistra or Duke or whoever. Separately from that, there's been, I'm sure you've talked about Centrus on this show before, but Centrus, which is the successor company of USAC, which is the successor company of the U.S. government's enrichment program. Centrus has basically for the past 12 years, over a decade, basically just been a uranium enrichment trader. And their big play has been a contract with 10X where they buy the 10X stuff and then sell it on to U.S. utilities. And they have one waiver, I think, but I don't know how much Russians love that situation. And I don't think the Russians love this whole ban on material in general, even with all the waivers. So what we saw happen last week was the Kremlin saying there will be a reciprocal ban on exports that can also get exemptions. And what is fully unknown now is what will that exemption process look like? Is this basically them saying we're doing the same thing, we have the same options? Or is them saying we're cutting off everything? Maybe 10X will convince us that there's some emergency shipment that needs to go, but otherwise nothing. Or this could be them saying or thinking, well, we'll still let some shipments go to the U.S. utilities to show we're acting in good faith. We're not cutting off plants, but we might not let anything go to Centrus, which would be a body blow to Centrus. So we're watching that. This is, who knows what will happen there, but it's an interesting one. And we'll see. There's a ship coming into St. Petersburg now, which is meant to leave in the next couple of days with a shipment of Centrus LEU heading to Baltimore in early next month. Sorry, this is making this all very time specific, but
Right. No, this is good. This is good.
but we're watching what happens to that shipment, and does it get loaded onto that boat or not? So it's a big question. One other tidbit, completely unrelated, I don't know, but just on the policy front, we did not talk about I talked about this very pie in the sky daydream of a lot of folks in the industry for some sort of backstopping of a fleet of AP1000s. Another huge thing the industry is really pushing for is some nuclear construction risk insurance. And basically, any new build developer you talk to or in utility, they are looking at that. Is Congress going to come through with that? And obviously, if they come through with that, what sort of ceiling will there be on how big a backstop that is?
It'll be interesting to watch this show, a couple of years from now and and
And
see
see
what
how
we missed.
wrong we are about
See what
everything.
we missed. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, very, very interesting to spitball with you today.
Thanks, Chris.
Cheers.